So good morning. We're about to work on this 94 Corvette. Previous video condemned the distributor cap and rotor. We don't exactly know what's wrong with it. I have a new one here. There's a standard blue streak number. This is what the cap and rotor looks like. This is the distributor cap, and it's in behind the water pump, as I mentioned previously. What can happen is the insulation quality can fail in the cap itself, and you can see the various internal conductors inside there that can actually cross conduct or leak through. Or we could have some moisture inside the cap, I'm not sure. A few years ago it was in here, and the customer had pressure washed the engine and ended up with condensation inside the cap, and it created a very similar problem. But we'll see once we get it apart. Now I've already started to disassemble here. I've removed the mass airflow sensor duct, because what we have to do is remove this water pump assembly to gain access to the distributor cap, which is in behind there. You can see the connection to the distributor. And then we're also going to put a set of plug wires on this thing while we're at it, because these are all original, being as how it's 25 years old. It's time to change them. So I'll pick up with the water pump removed. So you're going to have to raise the vehicle somehow to get access to the drain cock on the radiator, lower right hand corner. Drain the rad, remove 4 coolant hoses on the water pump, the 2 upper hoses and the 2 heater hoses. Disconnect the electrical harness and tuck it off to the side. Disconnect from the coil. There's the ignition coil there. You can see the distributor connector behind the water pump there. And a lot of coolant's going to, even though you drained the rad, considerable amount of coolant's going to run out of this lower rad hose or lower heater hose. So I've already rinsed off the residual coolant that's drained all over the frame, and we're going to continue to remove this water. Okay, so I've got the water pump out. There are 6 fasteners that hold the water pump in place, and you're going to need new gaskets, obviously, unless you change the water pump, which would come with gaskets. There's the drain hole on the weep hole on the water pump. If there's any evidence of coolant coming out of there, then I would strongly recommend to replace the water pump. In hindsight, probably wouldn't have been a bad idea considering the amount of labor involved in this. These bolts need to be cleaned up, and you notice that there's remnants of sealant on them, and that's because they go into the coolant passages. In fact, when you remove this lower bolt on this side, that side, well, both of them actually, a significant amount of coolant is going to run out even though you've drained the rad. Now, I managed to get it out without removing the throttle body as is indicated, nor the actual coil. If you're very careful and you turn it in just the right position, I did loosen off this bracket on the accumulator here, and so that the accumulator would drop down about 1/2 inch. And that allowed me to get it out of there. It's a bit of a challenge, but it's certainly doable. We're going to have to clean the gasket surfaces once we get that off. Now the next step is, if you were just changing the water pump, you could loosen the serpentine belt and just leave it off to the side like I have. But to get at this Optispark distributor cap, unfortunately the harmonic balancer's got to be pulled. So the belt's got to come off. And in fact, this belt's getting replaced because it's got some cracks in it, and it's probably original. So I got the harmonic balancer pulley off. There are 3 fasteners that hold it to the actual hub. You do not need to pull the center bolt, thank goodness. And to keep this thing from rotating while I was loosening these fasteners, I put 2 8mm bolts in these small holes on the outer circumference here. And then I used a pry bar between the 2 bolts like this, just so I could stop it from rotating backwards while I was loosening the bolts, and I'll be able to torque them. Now you notice there's a pointer on here, and it's already been marked on the outside circumference and on the crankshaft sprocket down there, the hub. So once we got this off, we should be okay. I might have to turn the engine slightly to put that ear out of the way of the distributor cap. Now I can remove the cap and the wires. So you need an E4 bit to remove these 4 screws that hold the distributor cap on. And then you need a, what is this size? Very small, T5 or something like that. for the rotor screws. So here's what happened inside there. The rotor started to fall apart. Come on, focus. And it was very close to failing completely. This piece is loose in here, and you can see how it's been arcing through the distributor cap. And it's amazing that it didn't fail completely. Well, that's where their little rubber seal goes. Well, we have a new cap and a new rotor. I'm going to clean the inside of the distributor housing and put it back together. So it's actually a T8 screwdriver you need for those little Torx bitted screws that are supplied with the rotor. They got Loctite on them already. So I've got the cap and rotor installed. There is a little metal spacer or disc behind the rotor. You make sure that didn't fall out. Has to be indexed correctly. So now we're going to just change out the spark plug wires and then reassemble. So new water pump gaskets would be really nice if these were self-adhesive, but I'm going to put a little contact cement on the block side and glue the gaskets onto the block, or maybe the water pump. I still have to clean up the water pump surface. I don't know why they sell the gaskets individually when you can't take it apart and just change one gasket, but that's a whole other issue. And I got the gasket surface cleaned on both sides, and we're going to put the water pump back in now. So the water pump is sitting on the engine, and I got the bolts all cleaned up and Teflon pipe dope on each bolt, ready to install. So I'm going to replace this bearing on the tensioner, not because it's rough, but because the pulley is worn and rounded. I'm afraid of the belt popping off. Probably won't. Sometimes these bolts that hold this pulley on are left-hand thread, but this one is not. It's a standard right-hand thread. The other pulley I'm going to replace is this one too. It's also worn, and I can't replace the bearings in there. If I just needed one, I would have reused this steel pulley off of a Chevy. It's the same size, and just replaced the bearing. It's a 6203 bearing inside there. And I keep those bearings in stock because you can press the bearing in and out of that steel wheel. But that's from another vehicle, so I've ordered 2 pulleys and I'm waiting for a parts delivery. So we're back together and running. New drive belt, new idler pulleys, new coolant, run up to temperature, no more misfire. Taking for a road test. I got my helper here, Shop Cat.